It is the night of the 12th of June, 1944, and a 27-year-old airman named Andrew Mynarski is trapped inside a machine that is burning alive around him. His Avro Lancaster has just been torn open by a German night fighter, 10,000 feet above occupied France. Both engines on the port wing are on fire. Hydraulic fluid is burning. The order has already crackled down the intercom: bail out. Bail out, one by one. His crewmates throw themselves into the black. Mynarski reaches the rear hatch, his parachute clipped on. 3 short steps from surviving the night. And then he looks back, trapped in the tail turret. Its hydraulics dead. The rear gunner is beating on jammed doors that will not open. He cannot get out. Between the two men stands a solid wall of flame. Mynarski stops. He turns away from the open hatch, away from the cold night air, away from the parachute that could carry him to the ground alive, and he begins to crawl the other way back into the fire, toward the one man on board who cannot save himself. Hold him there for a moment. A young man on his hands and knees in a burning bomber, making a choice most of us will never have to make. We will come back to Andrew Mynarski and to the choice he made in that fire. But to understand how tens of thousands of young men ended up in skies exactly like this one, we have to rewind to the two machines themselves, and the one impossible question their crews were built to answer. Welcome to Combat Atlas Fighters. Today we leave the fighters behind and climb into something bigger, slower, and far more terrifying to fly: the heavy bomber. 2 aircraft, 2 air forces, 2 completely different answers to the exact same impossible question. How do you cross the most heavily defended airspace on Earth? Drop your bombs! And bring 10 men home alive. Britain's answer was the Avro Lancaster. America's answer was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. One flew almost exclusively at night, hidden in darkness, trusting the black sky to be its shield. The other flew in broad daylight, trusting formation, firepower, and a bomb sight so precise its inventors claimed it could hit a barrel from 4 miles up. Neither belief survived contact with reality unchanged. Together, the 2 doctrines were supposed to add up to something greater than either alone, around-the-clock offensive. The RAF pounding Germany by night, the Americans picking up exactly where they left off by day. On paper, Germany would never get a moment's rest. In practice, each half of that clock was paying its own separate, brutal tuition before either one actually worked. So which bomber got it right? The honest answer is neither one. On its own. Forget the armor, forget the bomb load, forget the guns bristling from every turret. What actually decided who lived and who died was something almost nobody in either cockpit could see. Look for it in the airplane, and you will never find it. It lived in whichever nation learned, faster than the other, how to cover its bombers' one fatal blind spot. To understand what that was, you have to meet the 2 airplanes and the 2 disasters that built them. Our story starts on a runway in Ohio. In the autumn of 1935, a year earlier, the Army Air Corps had asked American industry for a new long-range bomber to replace its aging fleet. Boeing answered with something nobody had quite seen before: a sleek 4-engine giant they built almost entirely at their own expense. They called it the Model 299. When it rolled out, bristling with machine gun mounts in the nose, tail, and belly, a Seattle newspaperman looked at it and said just one thing. Why? It's a flying fortress. Boeing loved the name so much they trademarked it on the spot. The Model 299 first flew on the 28th of July, 1935, and it outclassed its rivals completely. It flew from Seattle to the evaluation field in just over 9 hours, faster than anything the competition had. The Army Air Corps was ready to order it by the hundreds. Then, on the 30th of October, came the flight that almost ended the entire program. 2 of the most experienced test pilots in America climbed aboard for a routine evaluation flight: Major Ployer Hill of the Army, and Boeing's own chief test pilot, Leslie Tower. The bomber lifted off, climbed steeply, and then stalled, nosed over, and crashed in flames. Both Hill and Tower were killed. The investigation found something almost too simple to believe. Before takeoff, a mechanism locking the elevator and rudder in place for parking. The gust lock had never been released. 2 of the finest pilots alive, flying one of the most advanced aircraft on Earth, had died because of a single switch nobody remembered to flip. Critics said the airplane was simply too complicated to fly safely. Boeing lost the contract on the spot, but a handful of engineers and pilots disagreed with the diagnosis. The airplane wasn't too complex to fly. The real trouble was simpler and far more human. No memory could reliably track every single step, every single time, under pressure. Their solution was almost embarrassingly simple: They wrote it all down, a short list of checks for taxiing, for takeoff, for landing one item at a time. Read aloud, ticked off by hand. It was the birth of the pilot's checklist, the exact tool every airliner on Earth still uses today. With that simple list in hand, Boeing and Army pilots flew the surviving prototypes 1.8 million miles without a single major accident. A legal loophole let the Army order 13 more for evaluation anyway. From that small order grew nearly 13,000 Flying Fortresses. The airplane that would help carry the American bombing campaign across Europe was born from a crash and saved by a piece of paper. Its very first shots of the war, in fact, weren't fired over Germany at all. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, a handful of unarmed B-17s arriving from California flew straight into the middle of the attack on Pearl Harbor, caught completely by surprise with empty gun mounts. Days later, other fortresses based in the Philippines were caught on the ground at Clark Field and destroyed before they ever left the runway. The airplane that would eventually come to define the American daylight air war over Europe spent its very first days on the losing end of a surprise attack. Thousands of miles from the theater that would make it famous, 6,000 miles away. In England, a very different disaster was giving birth to the B-17's counterpart. In 1936, Britain's Air Ministry asked for a new twin-engine bomber built around a brand new, unproven engine called the Vulture. The aircraft company Avro answered with a design called the Manchester. On paper, it looked promising. In the air, it was close to a death trap. The Vulture engine was essentially two smaller engines fused onto a single crankshaft, an elegant idea that overheated constantly and failed without warning. Manchester crews grew to dread their own airplane. Engine failures killed men even before the Germans got a chance to. Avro's chief designer, a meticulous engineer named Roy Chadwick, watched his own airplane fail again and again. By the middle of 1940, Chadwick had lost all faith in the Vulture engine, but he never lost faith in the airframe wrapped around it. So, quietly, without waiting for permission, he began sketching an alternative. Strip out the two unreliable Vultures, extend the wing, hang four of the proven, reliable Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in their place. The same engine already flying in the Spitfire and the Hurricane. It sounded almost too simple to be a real fix. On the 9th of January, 1941, the converted airframe took off for the first time, flown by test pilot Sam Brown. The transformation was immediate and total. Where the Manchester had been sluggish and dangerous, this airplane climbed eagerly and handled like a dream. Test pilots at Boscombe Down pushed it into a dive and took it past 360 miles an hour, an astonishing speed for a heavy bomber. They renamed it on the spot. It would no longer be called the Manchester III. It would be called the Lancaster. Chadwick's fuselage design left the wings free of fuel tanks, which meant the bomb bay running underneath could be built enormous and completely unobstructed 33 feet long, floor to sky. No other bomber of the war could swallow bigger bombs. Years later, Arthur Harris, the man who would command Britain's entire bomber force, wrote that this emergency redesign turned out to be, without exception, the finest bomber of the war. Britain already had two other four-engine heavy bombers in the fight, the Halifax and the Short Stirling. Neither one could match what Chadwick's emergency fix had produced. Squadron after squadron quietly re-equipped with the Lancaster wherever crews and factories could manage it, until it was doing most of the heavy lifting of the entire night campaign. By the war's end, the Lancaster alone was carrying roughly 2/3 of every ton of bombs Bomber Command dropped on occupied Europe. So now both nations had their heavy bomber, one born from a fatal crash and saved by a piece of paper, one born from a fatal engine and saved by four better ones. But building the airplane was only half the problem. Each nation still had to answer the one question that would define this entire air war, and they answered it in two completely opposite ways. When do you fly? In the first years of the war, Britain tried flying its bombers in the daylight, just like everyone assumed a modern air force should. It was a catastrophe. Unescorted daylight formations were cut to pieces by German fighters, and Bomber Command bled aircraft it could not replace. So Britain made a hard decision. If daylight meant death, they would simply stop flying in daylight. Bomber Command shifted almost entirely to night operations, trusting the darkness itself to be the shield no armor plate could ever be. There was just one problem. In 1941, a secret internal study revealed exactly how badly that darkness was working. It became known as the Butt Report, and its conclusion staggered the entire air ministry. Only one bomber in 3 was even landing its bombs within 5 miles of the intended target. Crews had been flying through flak, through fighters, through icing and blackout, night after night, and 2 out of every 3 of them weren't even hitting the right neighborhood. Winston Churchill read the report and called it, in his own words, a very serious paper requiring urgent attention. Britain had to make a choice: try to fix the accuracy, or abandon precision altogether and target something a pilot couldn't miss in the dark an entire city. On the 14th of February, 1942, the Air Ministry chose the second path 8 days later. A blunt, controversial commander named Arthur Harris took charge of Bomber Command, and the doctrine of area bombing was born. Harris pushed for a spectacle to prove the new doctrine could work a single raid using 1,000 bombers at once, scraped together from every squadron and training school in Britain. On the night of the 30th of May, 1942, that armada crossed the channel toward Cologne. 600 acres of the city burned. 45,000 people were left homeless. Of the 1,046 bombers that took part, only 40 were lost. It was proof, in Harris's eyes, that darkness plus overwhelming numbers could do what precision alone never could. New technology narrowed the miss further. Radio beams called G and oboe, and a ground mapping radar called H2S let crews find their targets even through solid cloud. A specialist unit called the Pathfinder Force flew ahead of the mainstream, dropping flares to mark the target for everyone behind them. Before any of that technology mattered, though, 7 strangers first had to become a crew. New airmen were simply gathered into a large hall at their training unit and left to sort themselves out. Pilots, navigators, gunners, and wireless operators mingling until small groups decided, almost by instinct, who they trusted enough to fly with. That crew, chosen in an afternoon, might fly together for a full tour of 30 operations or for only one. Now picture the inside of that darkness. A Lancaster crew of 7, packed into an unheated fuselage at 18,000 feet. Engines droning. The only light, the dim glow of instrument dials. Below them, a city they can't see yet, waiting for a flare that hasn't dropped. Their entire defense against the fighters hunting them isn't a turret. It's the dark itself, 7,000 miles of ocean away. An entirely different crew was betting on the exact opposite idea. American commanders never accepted the idea that a bomber had to hide. Their doctrine rested on a single article of faith, inherited from the earliest days of air power theory. The bomber will always get through. If a formation carried enough machine guns and flew close enough together, it could fight off fighters without ever needing an escort of its own. By 1943, American bombardment groups had refined this into something called the combat box. Squadrons staggered at different heights, each covering the others with overlapping fields of fire. A fully armed flying fortress could carry up to 13 heavy machine guns, aimed in every direction at once. Early fortresses, though, had a blind spot of their own. Almost nothing pointed straight ahead. German pilots found that weakness fast and began pressing head-on attack specifically to exploit it, closing at a combined speed that gave gunners only a second or two to react. Boeing's answer was a power-driven chin turret, bolted under the nose of the later G model, finally giving the fortress teeth pointed exactly where the danger had been coming from all along. And for aiming the bombs themselves, they trusted a device its own inventors claimed could put a bomb inside a pickle barrel from 4 miles up, the Norden bomb sight, in clear skies over a testing range in the Nevada desert. That claim was almost true. Over Germany, through cloud, flak smoke, and evasive maneuvers at 25,000 feet. It rarely was. Now picture the inside of that daylight, a B-17 crew of 10, in an unpressurized cabin so cold at altitude that exposed skin could freeze in seconds, watching black puffs of flak bloom in every direction. There is no darkness to hide in up here. Every enemy fighter pilot below can see them perfectly. Their entire defense isn't stealth. It's the sheer overlapping wall of fire from 100 other bombers flying in formation around them. Both doctrines sounded reasonable. Both were about to be tested to destruction over the exact same target. That target was a set of ball-bearing factories in a small German city, Schweinfurt, on the 17th of August, 1943. The 8th Air Force sent bombers deep into Germany to hit Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg in one coordinated strike. Fighter escorts could only reach so far before they had to turn back. Low on fuel, for over 2 hours every minute of it directly over German soil, the bombers flew completely alone. German fighters swarmed them without mercy, diving through the formations again and again. Imagine it from inside one of those fortresses. somewhere past the German border. With no friendly fighter anywhere in the sky, the tail gunner sees them first, a loose gaggle of German fighters, forming up well out of range. Passion, in no hurry at all. They already know the bomber has no fighter cover, and they know exactly how long the fuel gauge gives them to work. They come in head-on, 4 abreast, closing at a combined speed of nearly 500 miles an hour, too fast for most of the bomber's turrets to track in time. 20mm shells stitch across the nose of the neighboring fortress. Its cockpit disappears in a flash, and the big bomber simply rolls onto its back and falls out of formation. No one sees a single parachute open. Your own gunners are firing constantly now. 13 barrels roaring at once, brass shell casings piling up ankle-deep on the floor. It's exactly the wall of fire the Doctrine promised. And still, formation after formation, the fighters keep coming, because the Doctrine never accounted for how long 2 hours without an escort actually feels. By the time the survivors limped home, 60 bombers and 5 fighters were gone. 552 American airmen were dead, missing, or captured. It was an unsustainable loss rate. At that pace, no crew could statistically expect to survive their required tour of 25 missions. The obvious lesson was that deep raids needed a fighter escort that could go all the way to the target and back. That fighter did not exist yet, not in enough numbers. So the 8th Air Force, astonishingly, sent its bombers back to the exact same target, the exact same way. Less than 2 months later, on the 14th of October, 1943, 291 B-17s flew for Schweinfurt a second time. Fighter escort turned back at the German border. Just as before, the bombers fought a running battle completely alone for the rest of the way. 60 bombers went down. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. Over 600 men were killed, wounded, or missing. They called it Black Thursday. It was almost the exact same result as 2 months earlier proof that raw firepower and tight formation alone could not save a bomber deep inside enemy airspace. The 8th Air Force suspended deep, unescorted raids for the next 5 months. The self-defending daylight bomber, the whole article of faith the Doctrine had been built on, had just been disproven twice, over the exact same city, at a cost of over 1,100 men. Meanwhile, over on the night side of the war, the Lancaster had its own secret flaw, one that took horrifyingly long to even diagnose. For most of the war, a Lancaster's defensive guns pointed up, forward, and to the sides. Almost nothing pointed straight down. German night fighter crews eventually discovered that blind spot and built a weapon specifically to exploit it. They called it schräge Musik, slanted music, a pair of cannon mounted to fire almost straight upward, out of the top of the fighter's own fuselage. A German pilot could slide in directly underneath a Lancaster, invisible in its blind spot, and fire straight up into the fuel tanks in its wings. The bomber crew often never saw the attack coming and never knew what had hit them. German pilots guarded the secret carefully, and it took Allied intelligence a shockingly long time to even accept the weapon existed at all. Survivors who did make it home sometimes reported flames erupting from the wing with no warning and no attacker in sight, and were occasionally not even believed. For a long stretch of the war, entire Lancasters simply vanished from the bomber stream, and nobody left alive could say exactly why. Finding that Lancaster in the first place wasn't luck, Germany had built its own hidden system to hunt it, a network of ground radar stations and searchlight boxes, stretched across occupied Europe, fed each contact to a waiting night fighter, a defense the Allies nicknamed the Kamm-Huber line, after the general who built it. It was, in its own way, a dark mirror of the very radar network that had once saved Britain in the Battle of Britain, except now it was pointed the other way, right along inside a Lancaster instead, somewhere over the Ruhr. Engines droning at 18,000 feet. The rear gunner scans the black sky behind and above, exactly where every training manual says the danger will come from. He never thinks to look straight down. Nobody trained him to 200 feet below and slightly behind. A German night fighter slides into position, throttled back, invisible against the darker ground far beneath. Its pilot doesn't dive. He doesn't need to. He simply eases the nose up, lines the twin cannon on his own canopy roof with the black shape overhead, and fires straight up into the wing root. There is no tracer to warn them. No warning growl over the radio, just the wing bursting into flame from underneath, in a place none of the Lancaster's 7 guns can ever point. Within seconds, the bomber is falling, and the crew who do survive long enough to bail out will spend the rest of the war unable to explain what hit them. This threat had a face, and by 1944 he had become the deadliest hunter in the history of night combat. His name was Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, barely 22 years old, commanding his own night fighter group before most men his age had finished college. By the time the war ended, he had shot down 121 Allied bombers, more than any other night fighter pilot who ever lived, most of them Lancasters, found and killed in exactly the blind spot no one had thought to defend. On one single night, near the end of the war, flying 2 sorties, he shot down 9 bombers, 7 of them in barely 19 minutes. The group he commanded, Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, was among the units waiting in the dark on the night of the 30th of March, 1944, when Bomber Command sent 795 aircraft toward the ancient city of Nuremberg. Everything that could go wrong that night did. Forecasters had promised protective cloud along the outbound route. Instead, the sky turned crystal clear, a full moon lighting up 700 bombers like targets on a shooting range. Worse, the bombers' own engines began leaving thick white contrails against the moonlit sky, drawing a glowing signpost straight to the target for any fighter that cared to look up. German controllers ignored every decoy raid sent to confuse them, and simply parked their night fighters directly astride the bomber stream's planned route. For nearly an hour, German fighters tore into the stream almost unopposed. One pilot who survived the night described looking down and seeing what he called a battlefield, burning wrecks scattered across the ground in every direction. For as far as he could see, 95 bombers went down that single night. More Bomber Command aircrew were killed in those few hours than during the entire Battle of Britain. Crews who survived and made it home said it plainly in their debriefs afterward. Rifle-caliber machine guns built to fight the last war were simply no match for cannon firing. Night fighters built for this one. It became known, quietly, as Bomber Command's worst night of the entire war, and the men who inflicted it were not an abstract enemy. Some of them commanded by a 22-year-old who was only getting started. So this was where both bombers actually stood. Once the theory had met the war, the Lancaster could vanish into darkness, but it was blind underneath, and something invisible had learned to hide there. The Flying Fortress could bristle with more guns than almost anything else in the sky, but daylight meant it could always be found, and firepower alone couldn't close a 2-hour gap in fighter cover. Neither airplane's own design could fix its own doctrine's fatal flaw. Something else, entirely outside both cockpits, was going to have to close that gap. Here's the uncomfortable truth both air forces eventually had to face. The bomber was never going to save itself for the Flying Fortress. Salvation arrived in the shape of an airplane that wasn't even designed as a bomber escort. The North American P-51 Mustang, fitted with drop tanks slung under its wings, could suddenly fly all the way to Berlin and back, fighting the whole way. By early 1944, for the first time, American bombers could fly deep into Germany with a fighter riding shotgun the entire way, from the 20th to the 25th of February, 1944. American commanders finally put that new escort to the test on purpose, and at full force. They called it Big Week, nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties, aimed straight at the factories building Germany's fighters. But the bombs were only half the plan. This time, the bombers themselves were bait. Every German fighter that rose to defend those factories now had to fight through a wall of Mustangs and Thunderbolts that could follow them the entire way home. America lost bombers that week too well, over 100, but America could replace 100 bombers in weeks. Germany lost something it couldn't replace at all. More than 100 of its most experienced fighter pilots killed in a single week. By the week's end, the German Fighter Corps commander himself admitted it in private. In the long run, he said, his forces were fighting a hopeless battle. By the time the invasion of Normandy came that June, the sky above it belonged to the Allies. Big Week is a large part of why Cologne had proven darkness plus numbers could work. Big Week proved daylight plus an escort that could finally go the distance could work too. Loss rates finally began to fall. The self-defending bomber theory hadn't been proven right. It had simply stopped needing to defend itself alone. For the Lancaster, the equivalent rescue wasn't a gun turret. It was intelligence, and better radar of its own. Once crews and scientists finally pieced together how Schrager music worked, tactics changed, and later, aircraft carried downward-looking radar warning receivers to spot a fighter creeping in underneath. Better navigation aids kept improving too, letting the bomber stream move faster and tighter, giving German night fighters a smaller window to find their prey at all. In both cases, notice what actually saved the bomber crews. The thing that saved them wasn't a better bomb bay, and it wasn't a heavier gun. It was something built by a completely different team, for a completely different airplane. arriving just in time to do the one job neither bomber could ever do for itself. That's the answer the legend usually skips. Not armor, not bomb load. The deciding factor was daylight itself, whether you were built to be seen or built to disappear, and whether somebody else's invention was there to cover you either way. So let's settle the score, round by round. Round 1, raw bomb load. The Lancaster, and it isn't close. That unobstructed bomb bay could carry loads no B-17 ever touched, up to the 22,000-pound Grand Slam by war's end. Round 2, defensive firepower. The Flying Fortress. Decisively, 13 heavy machine guns against the Lancaster's much lighter rifle-caliber turrets. Round 3, accuracy on a good day. Roughly even, and worse than either Air Force wanted to admit, clear skies helped the American bomb sight. And even then, war conditions rarely matched the test range. Round 4, the fatal blind spot. Both bombers had won, and both paid for it in blood before anyone fixed it. The Fortress, in the open sky over Schweinfurt, the Lancaster in the darkness underneath. Round 5, the thing that actually decided survival. By the war's end, no contest. Whichever bomber got outside help covering its blind spot first survived. Neither earned that survival alone. Round 6, industrial replacement. The Fortress, by sheer weight of numbers. Nearly 13,000 B-17 rolled off American production lines against just over 7,000 Lancasters. In a war this brutal, the side that could rebuild its losses fastest bought its doctrine more time to be fixed. But none of this was free. Behind every one of those rounds sat 10 young men who never got to vote on the doctrine that put them there. By the war's end, the ledger for RAF Bomber Command was almost too brutal to say out loud. 55,573 aircrew were killed out of 125,000 who served, a death rate of 44%. A man serving in Bomber Command had worse odds of survival than a British infantry officer in the trenches of the First World War. And that grim number doesn't even count everyone who died learning to fly the Lancaster in the first place. Training accidents alone, in the crowded night skies over England, cost several thousand more young airmen who never lived to see a single German target. For comparison, America's own 8th Air Force, flying by day, lost 26,000 killed out of 350,000 aircrew, a far lower percentage. But still more dead than the entire United States Marine Corps would lose fighting across the Pacific. Add in the wounded and the men taken prisoner, and roughly 60% of everyone who ever flew an operational tour with Bomber Command became a casualty in one form or another. 6 men out of every 10 who climbed aboard a Lancaster never simply finished their tour and walked away untouched. 2 rival doctrines, each a different bet about when it was even safe to fly. And in the end, both of them killed young men by the tens of thousands before anyone outside the bomber itself found a way to cover for it. Let's put a face on each side of that ledger. On the night of the 16th of May, 1943, a 24-year-old wing commander named Guy Gibson led 19 specially modified Lancasters on one of the most audacious raids of the entire war. Their target was a set of dams deep in Germany's industrial heartland. Using a bizarre, brilliant weapon designed by an engineer named Barnes Wallace, a bomb that could bounce, like a skipping stone, across open water, flying at just 60 feet above the water, at night, under fire. Gibson's force breached the Muna and Eder dams, sending a wall of floodwater through the valley below. It became one of the most celebrated raids in the history of the RAF. It also came at a savage cost. Of the 133 aircrew who took off that night, 53 never came home, a casualty rate approaching 40% in a single mission on the ground. The flooding killed hundreds more, soldiers and civilians and forced laborers alike. On both sides of the fight, Guy Gibson was awarded Britain's highest honor for gallantry, the Victoria Cross, and became a national hero overnight. He hated being pulled off flying duty to tour and give speeches. He kept pushing to get back in the air. In September of 1944, flying a small wooden Mosquito on what should have been a routine mission, Gibson was shot down over occupied Holland and killed. For decades, no one knew exactly what brought him down. Then, years later, a haunted former Lancaster gunner finally admitted the truth. In the dark, in the confusion, he had mistaken Gibson's Mosquito for a German night fighter and shot him down himself. The man who breached the dams and became the most celebrated bomber pilot in Britain was killed, in the end, by his own side. In the same darkness, his airplanes had always trusted to keep them safe. Now turn to the other side of the ledger, and a story that, for once, ends with survival instead of loss. In late 1942, A 24-year-old pilot named Robert Morgan took command of a B-17 he named after his sweetheart back in Tennessee. He called it the Memphis Belle. In the first 3 months, his bomb group flew combat missions. 80% of the crews around him were shot down. Morgan would later tell school children exactly what those odds meant. You had breakfast with 10 men. By dinner, only 2 of them were still alive. To keep morale from collapsing entirely, commanders promised something almost nobody believed they'd actually see. Complete 25 missions. And you go home? Morgan and his crew flew through flak over French submarine pens, through fighter attacks that shot away their tail control, through raids so damaging that every major part of the airplane was eventually replaced at least once. On the 19th of May, 1943, the Memphis Belle and her crew landed after their 25th mission. They became the first full 8th Air Force bomber crew to complete a combat tour and return home to America without losing a single man. "We were not heroes," Morgan said years later. "We simply did our jobs, and were in the right place, at the right time. Given what the odds actually were for the men flying beside him, that was as close to a miracle as the daylight bombing campaign ever produced." Morgan didn't go home to stay. Within a year and a half, he was flying combat again, this time in the Pacific, commanding a brand new bomber against an entirely different enemy. On the 24th of November, 1944, Morgan piloted the lead aircraft on the first mission to bomb Tokyo since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. The man who survived the worst odds of the daylight war over Germany lived to lead the opening blow of an entirely new one over Japan. 2 bombers, 2 doctrines, 2 men who came to symbolize each one a hero killed by his own side in the darkness he trusted, and a survivor who lived because, for once, the odds broke his way. Think back to the bet the American generals had made that raw firepower alone could stand in for an escort fighter. That bet lost, twice, at Schweinfurt, before anyone admitted it and built the fighter that could actually close the gap. The Lancaster made its own version of that same bet that darkness alone was shield enough, and it lost that bet quietly, one vanished bomber at a time, to a weapon hiding in a blind spot nobody had thought to defend. History remembers the airplanes. It should remember, just as clearly, that neither one ever really saved itself. It took until 2012 for Britain to formally admit how heavy that debt really was. That year, the memorial to Bomber Command finally went up in Green Park, London, nearly 70 years after the war ended, and decades after other campaigns had already been honored. For decades, the sheer scale of civilian deaths caused by area bombing had made their own government reluctant to celebrate the men who carried it out, even the ones who never had a say in the doctrine, and simply climbed into the dark because they were told to. Today, both airplanes have all but vanished from the sky a second time, this time for good. Of more than 7,000 Lancasters built, exactly 2 can still fly, 1 in Britain, 1 in Canada. Every single other one is gone, and one of those 2 surviving Lancasters carries a name you already know, the Mynarski Memorial Lancaster, named for the 27-year-old we left crawling into the fire at the very start of this story. Here's how that moment ended. Mynarski reached the trapped gunner and fought the jammed turret with his bare hands, his own uniform and parachute burning around him, until there was simply nothing left to try. He could not free him. Ordered out at last, he stood, faced his trapped friend, saluted him through the flames, and jumped, his parachute already on fire. Andrew Mynarski died of his burns, and then came the cruel miracle. The tail gunner rode the crashing bomber all the way down, and somehow walked away alive, the only reason the world ever learned what Mynarski had done for him. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, today his name, and his squadron's colors. Fly again every summer on the very type of aircraft that burned him alive. The Fortress hasn't fared much better. Of nearly 13,000 B-17s, the most recent count puts only 3 still airworthy anywhere on Earth. 2 icons of that ferocious sky, reduced to a handful of aircraft each, kept flying only by volunteers who refused to let them, or the men who flew them, be forgotten. So here's where we leave you. It's 1943, you have 10 men counting on you, and exactly 1 seat to offer. Do you climb into the Lancaster fly-by-night, trust the darkness, carry a bomb load nothing else in the war can match, and hope nothing is waiting quietly underneath you? Or do you climb into the Flying Fortress fly-by-day in full view of every gun in Germany, trust 13 machine guns and the men flying beside you, and hope the fighters show up before the flak finds you first? The shield of darkness, or the wall of daylight steel? Which one would you trust with your life and with the 9 other men counting on you to bring them home? Tell me which cockpit you're climbing into, Kurt, and why. I read every single comment. Until next time on Combat Atlas Fighters, keep your speed up and your eyes on the horizon. Thanks for staying until the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Your support is incredibly valuable to us and helps this channel grow.